I also wanted to add that Verna was not feeling good today, and so she stayed home. She has been having some confusion, and because of that confusion, she gets very irritated, and so Rosa, her caregiver, felt like it's best for her to stay home. So let's keep Verna in our prayers, and we hope she can be with us next week as well. This morning I'm going to begin in John chapter 7. John chapter 7 and around verse 45. John 7 verse 45. And what we're going to talk about today, we're going to get back into our series about the origins of life. And so in John chapter 7 verse 45, we have the Jewish leadership has ordered the officers to go out and to arrest Jesus. They've had enough of the troubles he's caused by his words. And now the officers come back empty-handed. And verse 45, the officers then came to the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they said to them, "Why did you not bring him?" The officers answered, "Never has a man spoken the way this man speaks." The Pharisees then answered them, "You have not also been led astray, have you? None of the rulers or the Pharisees has believed in him, has he? But this crowd, which does not know the law, is accursed." Nicodemus, who came to him before, being one of them, said to them, "Our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him and knows what he is doing, does it?" And they answered him, "You are not also from Galilee, are you? Search the scripture, or search and see that no prophet arises out of Galilee." Now again, as you look at this story, you might wonder, what does this have to do with the origins of life? Well, like we talked about in the story where the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership would not admit that maybe Jesus cast out demons by the power of God, we find that greatly parallel to what is done as far as a response to the intelligent designer. I believe there's a lot of parallel to what's going on right here to the issue of the origins of life, and a reaction to those who believe in an intelligent designer. I want you to notice that first off, the officers come empty-handed, and when asked why, they give evidence. They say there's something different about Jesus. We've had a lot of people rise up and become nothing. A lot of people rise and claim to be something and draw people away, but this man's different. No one has spoken the way this man speaks. And I want you to notice also that Nicodemus says, listen, we have a law. And that law doesn't condemn a man until we first hear his case and we have witnesses. And in both cases, the response to that is intimidation and putting down that person. I want you to notice, they said, listen, we haven't believed in him. Have you? You haven't been led astray, have you? And to Nicodemus they said, you are not also from Galilee. That was kind of a name-calling thing, right? He says, search the scriptures. You'll see that no prophet arises out of Galilee. Well, that's true, but the scriptures say that one does come out of Bethlehem, and they hadn't done their homework fully on that. And I think the same thing happens in the world today, is that those who believe in God and believe in a creator and in scientific terms, an intelligent designer, oftentimes are going to be called fools. They're going to be called names. They're going to be put on a spotlight, and they're going to be told that they're crazy, lunatics, maybe even mentally ill. That's how some people see those who believe in creation. And I want to do this series not only to just remind Christians of the incredible evidence we have today, more than any other time, but I want our young people to know they're getting to that age where as they reach into those adult years, especially those that decide that they're going to go to college and expand their life through that means, that they're going to be put on that spotlight. And they're going to be told by their professors and their fellow students that they're fools, that they're crazy to believe that. And I want our young people to remember these lessons that they hear here at this church, that is not the case. That they're being called names and they're being derided because that so many want to look at this issue like the Pharisees looked at Jesus casting out demons. When evidence is presented to them, they don't deal with the evidence. They name call, they intimidate, they deride. And that's going to happen to our young people. But I want them to have confidence in their faith in God, the Creator, the intelligent designer. So, last time we had been talking about that third myth that many evolutionists adhere to and have to hold to, that in essence, what they do is make science do something science was never intended to do. Something science can't do. And basically what they do is make science the determiner of all things, the prover of all things. And so it goes like this. Okay? If science can't prove it, then science disproves it. That's the idea that if science can't prove something, then in essence science has disproved it. And that's just not the case. And so we are told that science, that God cannot be proven with science. And therefore what? Science disproves God. That's all wrapped up in this idea where we are told that evolutionists have the facts because they have the science and Christians have blind faith. That's all wrapped up in this. But the problem is that's just not what science does or what science can do. The reality is that it's a misunderstanding of what's called the NOMA principle. You're like, what is that? Well, NOMA obviously is an acronym. And let me show you what that acronym is and what it stands for. It won't help you at all, but I'll explain it to you. NOMA stands for the non-overlapping magisterial authorities. You're like, well, that doesn't help. Yeah, I understand that. Basically what this is a principle showing that science and God don't overlap. That they can't be used to prove one another. In other words, when we look at science, science is designed and was created to explore and to observe and to experiment with the natural world, with things that are happening right now, things that we can see and things that we can touch, things that we can observe and things we can experiment with. And what science was is looking at all that and making conclusions called hypotheses. And then what? You observe the natural world. You set up some type of experiment where you're going to either observe or manipulate it in some way. And science has a whole set of criteria in order for that experiment to be a valid experiment, so that the results are concrete and truthful. In other words, it's standards so that personal bias don't enter in. And then once you do that, then you can look at your hypothesis based on your observation, experimentation, and you can figure out, yes, I was right, and now I can put some evidence to that. Or, no, I was wrong, But now I understand better, and so I can change my hypothesis and bring out the evidence leads this way. That's what science does. But over the years, what has happened is we've turned it around to where the hypothesis is fact. And now what we're doing is we're just trying to find the right observation or experimentation that's going to prove the hypothesis. And so if we do an observation or experimentation that shows our hypothesis of evolution to maybe be invalid or doesn't really point logically to it, then we discard that. We ignore it. We get rid of it. And we do another observation experimentation. And this one, well, we like this one. This has some good validity to our hypothesis. So we add that to our cart. The hypothesis won't change, the experimentation will. It's reverse of what science was created to do. What has happened in the world today is that scientists try to observe and experiment with the natural world, the here and now, and come up with results. And then, with those modern day results, then they go to the past and they tell you what happened in the past. The problem with that is science cannot observe, it cannot experiment with the past, can it? And so what you're getting, what our kids are getting when they go into that science classroom, is they're getting some of the experiment evidence, and they're getting a whole lot of interpretation, a whole lot of theory. Because this happened today, that means this happened in the past. But that's an interpretation. That's a theory. It's not fact. But that's the problem. Our kids are not told, here's the evidence, here's the interpretation. What we're telling you is based on a little bit of evidence, but a whole lot of... They're not told that. It's all slapped together and said it's fact. That's not what science does. And so science is made to do something it can't do. And we're told science proves this in the past, and therefore it disproves this in the past. So science deals with the natural world, but when we talk about God, God is supernatural. He's beyond nature. And so you can't do an experiment with God. You can't do an experiment that proves God. Now let me say this. That doesn't mean you can't observe or experiment with the natural world, and as you look at the natural world and the evidence of what you're observing, to say, okay, which one points to a more logical answer? Does what I'm looking at suggest more logically that there's some intelligence that's involved here, or that this happened by random chance and circumstance and random mutations over millions of years? And a lot of times, most of the time, what we're seeing today is there's complexity as we observe and as we experiment. And there's great organization. And that everything in that system has to be present at the same time, at the beginning, in order for that system to work. And what kind of system is it? It's a system of life. You're missing one component, you're missing life. That organism is not alive. It's got to have everything together. And so as they look at that, what? Well, that suggests more logically not chance and circumstance, but intelligence. There's design in that. And sometimes even scientists, as they explain these life systems, they'll use the word design. It goes and does exactly what it's designed to do. But then they'll tell us, but it's not created by an intelligent designer. God is supernatural, and therefore his existence falls not within the realm of science, but it's a metaphysical question. It's beyond the physical world. And that's what the Noma principle is. Science doesn't overlap into the supernatural world. It's not designed to prove or to unprove the things in the supernatural world. And so what we have in the world today is this almost a myth in itself, that where some act as if science is the only evidence. But what I want to show you this morning is that there are things that can't be proven with science. There are things that we hold as true. Things that existed, events that happened, people that are real, that we believe wholeheartedly in everyday life. Our kids go to school to learn about these things and about these people, but none of them can be proven with science. For example, George Washington. George Washington and his existence cannot be proven with science because George Washington lived in the past. And yet, we have parks named after George Washington. We have schools named after George Washington. We have states named after George Washington. You say, wait a second. We've got writings from George Washington. We have his house that George Washington lived in. You can see all those things. Yes. That is evidence of George. It's not scientific evidence. It's another kind of evidence. And so if we're going to be consistent and say science cannot prove the existence of God, therefore it disproves existence, then we've got to get rid of our belief in George Washington as well. World War II cannot be proven with science. It's something that happened in the past. Now, someone says, wait a second. I can go over to Europe. I can go into Germany. I can go out in the fields where these battles took place. I can scientifically look at the soil, and I can find ammo and gunpowder and ashes of burned out things from this war, and therefore that's World War II. It's evidence of that. Yes, but it does not prove that that's World War II. There's other explanations for why that exists. Maybe World War I. But that's exactly what we're talking about. Yes, you can use science and you can go and experiment the soil or do other experimentations and say, look at the evidence. Now, where does it point? World War II actually happening? Or that this is attributed to some other event? But even in that, you're not proving dogmatically the existence or non-existence of something. World War II is a past event, and science can't deal with the past event. You say, wait a second, my kid goes to history class and they learn about World War II and there's pictures about it. And absolutely, there is evidence. But it's not scientific evidence. Babe Ruth cannot be proven with science. Or the moon landing cannot be proven with science. Now, there are some people that would be like, amen, that was all a hoax, right? It was all a political TV stunt, the moon landing. Now, there is science you can do to try to find evidence of the moon landing. If any of you might remember a Big Bang Theory episode where they're up on the roof, and apparently, I don't know if this is true, but they talked about the astronauts putting some type of reflectors up on the moon, and they shot a laser up there, and then the laser reflected off and came back as evidence that there were human beings on the moon. That reflection would not have happened any other way. Well, there is evidence. There is scientific evidence, but it doesn't prove it. And you might say, "What, are you crazy? That's just concrete evidence. There's no other way to explain it." Well, the problem with is there's the same type of evidence for an intelligent designer, but they don't want to say it's there. No, if we're going to say science, if science doesn't prove it, then it disproves its existence. We've got to get rid of a whole lot of stuff that we hold dear, that we shape our identity as a country, that we take pride in our world and our society. In fact, someone once said, if all that we have is science, then we're not going to believe in very much. There's lots of things science cannot dogmatically prove. But it's one of those things, and you see it all the time, that in everyday life, in the real world, we use these things and these rules, and they're acceptable. But then when it comes to God, the Bible, creation, Jesus, all these rules, they just get thrown out. We can use historical evidence to show the existence of George Washington or World War II or Babe Ruth or the moon landing. We can use other types of evidence, and we believe wholeheartedly that those other types of evidence show God did, or that those people and those events did happen. But when we come to God, then we can't do that. We can't use other kinds of evidence. It's only science. And that's just not true. It's just not logical. Now, I know people like to use this because it makes it so easy to say, well, science disproves God. There's no scientific evidence for the existence of God. And boom. But that's just too easy. It's just not accurate. And the thing is that we have to be careful as creationists, as believers in that great intelligent designer of God, that we're not doing the same thing as those who like to deride and call names and say you're a bunch of fools. Because we can take that stand and we can argue from that standpoint as well. And I know it's easy. And I know it makes us feel good. But that's not the way to deal with the evidence, and that's not the way to convince people, and it's not the way to show our confidence in what we believe, to where we will actually convince people. So, George Washington, World War II, Babe Ruth, the moon landing, you could just add a whole bunch of them. Things we hold dear and believe. They all have to go away if that's the type of standard of science. But you know what else? There's something else that would have to be taken away. And that is the Big Bang Theory. And I want you to notice very carefully that last word, theory. They call it a theory, and that's what it is. It's a theory. But they don't treat it like a theory. Our young people go to science class and they're just told that this is what happened. But I want to tell you, you got to throw it away because science cannot prove the Big Bang Theory. Now, what scientists try to do all the time is they try to do their observation, experimentation in what's going on in the world today. And then they say, oh, look, that's evidence of the Big Bang Theory. And then they elaborate on all this that happened. But what you're getting is some little experimentation, some little evidence here, but a whole lot of interpretation. Nobody was there. In fact, in evolution, we're talking about man doesn't arrive on scene until millions of years later, after the supposed Big Bang. What was the earth like? What was there? How did the first thing came about? And that's an answer that science can't answer, a question that science can't answer, and neither can scientists. They can interpret, they can hypothesize. But see, they're not going to get rid of the Big Bang Theory, even though science can't prove it. But that same logic doesn't go oftentimes with a lot of them when it comes to God and science. Stephen Jay Gould, you probably have heard of him, was, he's no longer alive, was a very well-known atheist, evolutionist, die-in-the-heart evolutionist, biologist, historian. You can read a lot of what he wrote about the subject. But the thing about Stephen Jay Gould is that he was able to be honest about a lot of this stuff when it came to evolution. And he often talks about the NOMA principle in his writings. And here's a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, an atheist, an evolutionist. But here's what he says in this Science Having to Prove God. To say it for my colleagues and for the umpteenth millionth time, that sounds like a very scientific terminology, science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, educate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm nor deny it. We simply cannot comment on it as scientists. He says science can't do that. Science shouldn't be made to do that. We shouldn't make a comment on the existence of God as being disproven by science. It doesn't overlap. It has no authority in that. There's other evidence we have to use. So as we bring our lesson to a close this morning, let's look at a few passages of those in the Bible, and not only what they believed, but how confident they were. This is a confidence that was in the world for generation after generation after generation. Only recently have we been told to doubt the old answer. Only recently we have a new answer. But look at what the Hebrew author, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4 writes. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. He's not saying maybe. He's very confident in that. And everybody in his world and his time basically were. We talked in a lesson not too long ago about how even pagan idolaters answer the question, how does this all come about? Through creation. They may not have given credit to Yahweh, but there's no evolution in the past by the ancients. Even those that deny Yahweh believed it all came through a creation. Let's take a look at Psalm 19, verse 2. I call it the Old Testament version of Romans chapter 1, verse 20. So instead of reading Romans 1:20, let's read Psalm 19, verse 2, where the psalmist says, the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands. Remember Romans chapter 1, verse 20, where Paul says, the invisible God is explained by everything that has been created. Everything in the world shows His invisible attributes, shows His divine nature. Here, the psalmist says the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands. We sing a song, hymn number 2 in our songbooks. Praise Jehovah. And I won't take the time to read that. But as you read through the lyrics of that song, what is it doing? It's calling on everything in the world. The moon, the sky, the stars, the sun, the trees, the valleys, the mountains. Man, to sing praises to Jehovah. And you know what? Everything that's around us, everything, the trees, the mountains, the valleys, the stars, the sun, the moon, whatever you could to list, Every day they sing the praises of God. If you look at it, you will see the intelligent designer. You'll see the complexity. You'll see the order. You'll see how it all works together, how it knows how to turn it on and how to shut it off. You can see it clearly if you don't have a biased heart against Jesus casting out demons by the power of God. Psalm 139, verse 14. I will give thanks to thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are thy works. And look at what he says, and my soul knows it very well. Does your soul know it very well? Young people, are you confident that everything you see around us, that life came about by an intelligent designer called God? I want you to have confidence in that. Because there's coming a time where you're going to be challenged. You're going to be put in the spotlight. You're going to be derided. You're going to be told you're a fool to believe in it. I want us to know that if our kids go into a public university, a public college, and I'm not saying that against that, but I want you to know that they're going to be facing some things that we teach them are wrong. They're going to have to do papers on transgender and why that's good and right. And that teacher is going to want the right answer. They're going to have to be taught about homosexuality and why that's normal and should be accepted. And yes, they're going to be taught about evolution and why it's complete craziness for someone to still believe in the old answer of a creator. Thank you so much for your attention. We're going to turn over to Mike, who has their song service.